George's voice boomed through the front door, pulling me from the quiet hum of my evening. I was in the kitchen leaning over the sink, rinsing out the last of the dinner plates, when I heard the front door creak open. "Gloria, I'm home." "Got someone with me." His voice was loud like always. But there was an unfamiliar reason it wasn't often George brought someone home unannounced. I dried my hands quickly and smoothed out the front of my sweater, a habit I never quite grew out of. Even after all these years of marriage, I shuffled to the entryway just as George stepped in, followed closely by another man, a stranger at first. All I saw was his silhouette, tall, slim but sturdy, with broad shoulders and a posture that said he wasn't just here to make small talk. When the man stepped forward into the light, the sight of him took the air right out of my lungs. "Gloria, this is Russell." George clapped a hand on his friend's shoulder. "He's my new hire down at the company. Sharp as a tack, this one. We got some things to go over for tomorrow's big meeting, so I figured we'd handle it here with a little peace and quiet." The man, Russell, gave me a small, polite smile, but there was an undeniable glint in his eyes. He was beautiful, dark skin, smooth and flawless. His cheekbones looked like they were chiseled out of stone, his jaws sharp enough to cut glass. A well-trimmed beard framed his full lips. I realized with a jolt. My face grew hot as I forced myself to focus. "Nice to meet you, ma'am." His voice was deep calm, but there was a warmth to it, as if he carried the sunshine wherever he went. Same here." I managed my voice. "Welcome to our home." I glanced over at George, who had already kicked off his shoes and tossed his coat onto the armchair. He was so comfortable, oblivious to the way this Russell fellow radiated something magnetic. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I felt drawn like a moth toward a porch light on a summer night. I needed a distraction fast. "Can I get you boys some coffee?" I asked, slipping back into my role as hostess. Trying to ground myself. "That would be great, honey," George answered with a grin, already setting down a stack of papers on the dining table. "Coffee sounds good," Russell added, his gaze lingering on me just a little longer than necessary. I felt my chest tightened, not in discomfort, but in something far more confusing. It was subtle, that look, but it was enough to make my pulse skip a beat. In the kitchen, I busied myself with the coffee, hands slightly shaky as I measured out the grounds. My mind was running in circles, trying to make sense of the odd sensation blooming inside me. I hadn't felt something like this in years, decades maybe. George and I had been married for 33 years, and our love was solid. It had settled into something predictable. Comforting, yes, but predictable, a life of routines. Coffee at 6 a.m. Evening news at 7 p.m. Conversations about grocery lists and retirement plans. And now, here is this young man, Russell, vibrant, confident, handsome, in a way that felt almost dangerous. I scolded myself silently. I was old enough to be his mother. For heaven's sake, I had no business getting flustered over someone like him, but the warmth in my chest refused to go away. When I brought the tray into the dining room, they were already deep in conversation. George was droning on about sales projections, graphs, and God knows what else, while Russell listened, nodding along, that easy smile still playing on his lips. I placed the tray on the table and began pouring their cups. George barely looked up to wrapped up in his business talk. But Russell, he glanced at me again. Just for a moment. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, taking the cup from my hand. His fingers brushed mine ever so slightly. The touch was brief, barely a second, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "You're welcome," I murmured, heart thudding in my chest. I took a step back, clasping my hands together to keep from fidgeting. It wasn't just that Russell was attractive. It was the way he carried himself. He exuded this quiet confidence, a calm assurance that made you want to lean in closer, just to hear what he might say next. George, meanwhile, continued talking, oblivious to the strange tension filling the room. I wondered if he could feel it, if he even noticed how Russell's presence seemed to shift the air around us. I settled into a chair on the other side of the room, pretending to flip through a magazine, though I couldn't focus on a single word. Instead, I stole glances at the two men across the table. George looked exactly like the man I'd married all those years ago. Graying hair, a slight punch from too many beers and barbecues, and the familiar furrow in his brow whenever he talked about works. And then there was Russell, young, lean, with arms that looked like they belonged to someone who took care of himself. The contrast between them was stark, and I found myself wondering if I were 30 years younger, would I have fallen for someone like Russell? The thought startled me. I shifted in my seat, crossing my legs to dispel the heat creeping up the back of my neck. "Hey, Gloria," George called, breaking my reverie. "Would you mind grabbing us some snacks? Maybe those pretzels you like." Of course, I forced a smile, grateful for the excuse to leave the room again. In the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, pressing my cool hands against my fleshed cheeks. What was wrong with me? I wasn't some lovesick teenager. I was a grown woman, married, settled, content. And yet, the way Russell looked at me, the way he spoke, calm, respectful, but with just the slightest hint of something more, it made me feel alive. I hadn't realized how much I missed that feeling. Back in the dining room, I placed the bowl of pretzels on the table and hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to stay or go. Russell glanced up at me again, his eyes soft but focused, as if he saw more than I intended to show. "You've got a beautiful home, ma'am," he said, his voice low and smooth. "Thank you," I whispered, feeling foolish for the way my heart fluttered at his words. George chuckled. "Yeah, Gloria's got an eye for decor. She's always rearranging stuff. Drives me nuts, but it looks good. Doesn't it?" Russell smiled, but his gaze stayed on me just for a moment, longer than necessary. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of small talks and business chatter. I sat quietly, listening to them discuss spreadsheets and quarterly reports, though my mind was far away. When Russell finally stood to leave, I followed him and George to the door. "Thank you for having me," he said, turning to me with that same warm smile anytime I replied, the words slipping out before I could stop them. George clapped him on the back. "See you tomorrow, buddy." And then just like that, he was gone. I stood by the door watching as Russell walked down the driveway, his stride easy and confident. George locked the door and gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. "Thanks for putting up with us tonight, hun. You the best." I smiled weakly, still lost in thought, as I turned off the lights and climbed into bed beside my husband. I couldn't shake the image of Russell from my mind. His voice, his smile, the way his fingers had brushed against mine. It lingered like the scent of rain on a warm summer night. And for the first time in a long time, I found myself wondering what it might feel like to be seen again. Russell came by more often after that first evening. George would invite him over to discuss work, projects that needed extra attention, or sometimes just to unwind after a long day at the office. Russell fit easily into our home, like he'd always belonged, lounging on the couch, with a relaxed charm that seemed to fill every room he entered. At first, I only observed him from a distance, like a bird watcher, who couldn't get too close or risk scaring off the prey. He was always polite, always friendly, his smile warm, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Whenever he laughed at George's tired jokes, and oh, did he laugh deep and smooth, like honey dripping from a spoon, a sound that lingered long after the moment passed. I told myself it was harmless. So what if I liked having him around? So what if I lingered just a second longer than necessary? When serving him coffee, or handed him a cold beer, with a smile that might have been a little too bright, it didn't mean anything, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. Over the next few weeks, Russell's visits became routine. Tuesday evenings, Friday nights, sometimes even the odd Sunday afternoon. The more he came over, the more comfortable he became. Not just with George, but with me too. He'd lean against the kitchen counter while I prepared snacks, chatting easily about work, life and everything in between. He told me stories about his childhood, his family back in Detroit, and the UPS and downs of working with George. I found myself drawn to the way he spoke. His voice smooth and effortless, laced with humor and just the right amount of vulnerability. And slowly a familiarity began to grow between us. It was in the little things, like how he'd wink playfully whenever George made a fuss about something trivial, or how he'd thank me every single time I handed him a drink, his fingers brushing mine just for a moment longer than necessary. It was the way his gaze would linger on me, not in an overly obvious way, but just enough for me to feel noticed. It seemed like I was more than just George's wife. It was intoxicating. Then came the night I got his number. It wasn't planned, it just happened. One of those evenings, when George had gone upstairs to take a phone call, leaving Russell and me alone in the living room. We were sitting across from each other, the conversation easy and light. I don't even remember what we were talking about. Something inconsequential, like favorite movies or travel plans that never seemed to materialize. And then out of nowhere, I found myself saying, "You know, if you ever get bored, you can text me." The words were out before I could stop them. Russell raised an eyebrow, a small knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You want my number, Gloria." I felt my cheeks flush, but I forced a casual shrug. "Only if you want to give it to me." He pulled out his phone without hesitation. "Here, give me yours too. That way it's fair." I handed him my phone. And just like that, his name and number were saved in my contacts. Simple, innocent, at least on the surface, but deep down, I knew that something had shifted. It started with texts, short, harmless messages. "Hope George isn't driving you too crazy tonight, huh? You have no idea, I can imagine. Hang in there, you've got this." His text became a lifeline on the days when the house felt too quiet and the hours stretched endlessly. Just knowing that someone out there was thinking of me, even in the smallest way, made all the difference. And then one day I called him. It was a Tuesday afternoon. George was stuck in meetings all day, and I was sitting on the porch, sipping iced tea and feeling restless. Before I could talk myself out of it, I dialed Russell's number. "Hey Gloria," He answered, his voice warm and familiar. I smiled, feeling that now familiar flutter in my chest. "Hi, just thought I'd see what you're up to." He chuckled softly. "Not much." "You sound bored, I am." I sighed dramatically, twirling a loose strand of hair around my finger. "Thought you could entertain me." Russell's laughter rumbled through the phone, deep and easy. "You always call me when you're bored, and you always answer." I shot back, grinning, "Because I like talking to you." The way he said it made my heart race. I took the phone closer to my ear, enjoying the warmth of his voice, wrapping around me like a soft blanket. Those calls became our thing, our little secret. I'd call him whenever I felt lonely or restless, and he'd always pick up no matter where he was or what he was doing. We talked for hours, sometimes about everything and nothing. I learned that he loved jazz music, hated cold weather, and dreamed of traveling to Italy someday. He learned things about me too, things I hadn't shared with anyone in years. And slowly, without even realizing it, I found myself looking forward to those conversations more than anything else. Then came the day it all changed. It was a Friday morning, just like any other. George had left for work early, leaving me alone, with nothing but the ticking of the kitchen clock for company. I picked up my phone, my fingers hovering over Russell's number. I knew I shouldn't. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't help myself. I hit dial. "Hey, Gloria." Russell answered on the first ring. "What's up?" "Not much," I said, my voice a little breathless. "George is at work." There was a pause on the other end, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his mind. "Want me to come over?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. Yes. When the doorbell rang 20 minutes later, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I opened the door, and there he was, standing on the porch, looking as calm and collected as ever. "Hey," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Hey," I whispered, stepping aside to let him in. He walked past me, his scent, something warm and earthy, filling the space between us. I closed the door, my hands trembling slightly. We stood there for a moment, the silence between us thick with unspoken tension. "You okay?" he asked softly, his gaze searching mine. I nodded, my throat dry. "Yeah, I'm glad you came." Russell smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made my knees weak. Me to Gloria. We sat on the couch, a comfortable silence settling between us. I tried to keep my hands still, but my fingers tapped nervously on my thigh. The air felt heavy with possibility, charged with something unspoken, like a storm waiting to break. Russell leaned back, stretching his long legs in front of him. He looked good, too good. His fitted shirt clung to his lean, muscular frame, and his dark skin seemed to glow under the soft light of the room. I glanced at him, trying to read his expression, but he was staring straight ahead, one hand resting on his knee. He looked hesitant. I decided to break the silence, a small playful smile tugging at my lips. "So, Russell," I began, my voice light but suggestive. "What do you think of me?" He glanced at me sideways, an almost bashful smile spreading across his face. "You're something else, Gloria." "Oh," I tilted my head. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" He chuckled softly, looking down at his hands. "Definitely good, you're sweet," I whispered, shifting a little closer. Our knees brushed, and I felt a spark ignite deep inside me. but you're kind of shy." He laughed nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess I am." I smiled, emboldened by his bashfulness. "You don't have to be shy around me." My hand slid slowly over his, testing the waters. When he didn't pull away, I let my fingers trail along his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my touch. His breath hit slightly, and I knew I had him. "Gloria," he whispered, his voice a mix of uncertainty and passion. So I murmured, pressing a finger gently against his lips. I know. I leaned in closer, my heart beating fast. I've wanted this for so long. I whispered, my lips brushing his ear. He exhaled shakily, his hands resting awkwardly at his sides, as though he didn't know what to do with them. I smiled to myself, feeling a heady mix of power and yearning. I ran my hand on his chest, feeling the fur muscles beneath his shirt. His breath grew heavier, and when I kissed the corner of his mouth, he turned his head ever so slightly, meeting my lips with his. I felt his hands finally come to life, gripping my waist as though he'd been holding back for too long. I gasped softly, the sound surprising even me. "Let's go somewhere more comfortable," I whispered, pulling back just enough to see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He nodded, and I took his hand, leading him toward my room. My heart raced with excitement and nervousness, but there was no going back now. In my room, we tumbled onto the bed. Russell's hands roamed over me, tentative at first, then more assured as I responded. There was something exhilarating about his shyness, the way he hesitated, as though unsure if he should be doing this. It made me feel powerful, like I was guiding him into something forbidden, yet irresistible. He leaned over me, and I felt a sense of fulfillment. He was both gentle and urgent, and I lost myself in the moment, the world outside disappearing as we explored each other. Just as we were on the brink of giving, and completely, I heard the front door open. My heart stopped. Russell froze above me, his eyes wide with panic. We heard the familiar clink of George's keys hitting the hallway table, and then footsteps slow and deliberate, coming down the hall. "Oh, my God," I whispered, scrambling to sit up, my mind raised with a million thoughts. How to explain, how to fix this. But before I could move, the bedroom door swung open. George stood in the doorway, calm and composed, his expression unreadable. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Russell sat frozen beside me, his chest rising and falling rapidly. For a long, agonizing moment, none of us said anything then. To my utter shock, George smiled. "Well," he said, his voice smooth and easy, as though he just walked in on us watching TV. "Looks like everything is going according to plan." I blinked, trying to make sense of his words. What do you mean?" George stepped into the room, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. "I brought Russell into our lives for a reason." I stared at him, disbelief and confusion swirling inside me. "What are you talking about?" He smiled again, a strange glint in his eyes. "I wanted to see what you do. I needed to know if you still had passion, if you still crave excitement. And clearly you do." My mind reeled. "You set this up," I whispered, my voice shaky with disbelief. George nodded, unbothered by my shock. "I knew if I asked you for something like this outright, you'd say no." I shook my head, struggling to wrap my mind around what he was saying. "You wanted this to happen?" "Yes." His gaze flicked briefly to Russell, then back to me, I wanted to reignite something between us. A spark Gloria, something we lost a long time ago. My heart pounded in my chest, torn between disbelief and an unexpected thrill. "You're into this," I whispered, barely able to believe what I was hearing. George's smile deepened. "I've been wanting to explore something different." A new dynamic. He glanced at Russell again, then back at me, his expression calm. "Ensure I'm into this dynamic, Gloria." I wanted to see how far we could go. A shiver ran down my spine. Part fear, part excitement. George stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You're enjoying yourself, are you?" I gulped, my body still buzzing with adrenaline. George sat down in the chair by the window, crossing one leg over the other. "Don't let me stop you," I stared at him, my heart beating like a drum. "Go on," George said softly, his voice filled with calm authority. "Enjoy yourself." For a moment I hesitated, my mind racing with doubts and questions. But then I looked at Russell, his eyes filled with uncertainty, and something inside me shifted. This was happening, and strangely, it felt right. I leaned back toward Russell. He hesitated for only a second. Then his hands slowly found their way to my waist. I felt George's gaze on us, steady and unwavering, as Russell and I gave in to the moment once more. The tension, the thrill of the forbidden, it all came rushing back stronger than ever. And this time there was no holding back.